The contents of the lab report are meant for educational purposes only and are not meant to be misconstrued as medical diagnosis or treatment advice.
Today, on the lab report, we're going to talk about some heavy metals.
How heavy are we talking here? Metallica, Iron Maiden?
No, not that type of heavy metal, although they could be referred to as a poison.
Ooh. The world of medicine can be challenging. Clinicians and patients are always looking for more options, more effective treatments, and in the end, more answers. Functional and integrative medicine focuses on addressing root causes of disease. Here at Genova Diagnostics, we've watched this field evolve and grow for over 35 years. We've not only adapted, we've led. Join us as we talk about functional medicine, laboratory testing, and optimizing health. Welcome to the Lab Report. Speaking of heavy metal, I'm an 80s girl. Tesla was my first concert. What was yours?
James Taylor.
Exactly. Says it all.
Hello!
Hey, Michael Chapman.
Hi, Patti Devers. How are you today?
I'm living my best life. How are you doing?
I'm also living my best life.
Great.
And we're both on the same page there, living our best lives.
Good.
How lucky are we, huh?
We're super lucky.
Not only for the fact that we're living our best lives, but we have this podcast called The Lab Report, and it's brought to you by Genova Diagnostics. Thank you, Genova. And thank you all for joining us in this podcast called The Lab Report, where we talk about functional medicine, specialty lab testing, integrative therapeutics, and the like.
Yeah. If you like this podcast and you're new to it, welcome.
Hi.
And if you're returning, thank you.
Hi
and
again.
by now, hopefully you've gone to iTunes or Spotify and subscribed to this podcast. Maybe rate, review, leave us some feedback there.
And if you have additional feedback, you can always email it. You really can. You can email it to podcast@gdx.net, and we'll take a look at it, and we'll get back to you, actually. We're good at that.
Fairly
We're
good.
Yeah, well, I mean, good is a relative term, right? And speaking of good, I mean, James Taylor's good. What are you saying about James Taylor, and what are you furthermore saying about me as far as
I'm not,
fan of James Taylor?
I actually love James Taylor. I'm just reflecting back on the concept that my first concert was Tesla and yours was James Taylor, and I think it just speaks volumes about the people we've become.
Okay, well, if it speaks volumes, please elaborate on these volumes that it speaks, because I feel like once again,
No.
this is somehow reflecting or
No,
casting
no.
shade
Michael,
on
no.
my on my
We all love
personality
James
type.
Taylor.
That's right, sweet baby James, Fire and
See?
Rain.
We
You've
all
got
love it.
look, you've got a friend right
We
there.
all love it.
You see that maybe if there's something that speaks volumes, I just want to be friends with people, you know.
Oh, that's sweet. But
And Carolina in my mind apparently was apropos, because here I am.
see, it did shape who you've become.
Wow.
Bringing it back.
Wow, that's some good armchair psychology we just did there.
Right. But the bigger point is today's episode is all about heavy metals and toxic exposures. And the audience might remember that we touched on this a few times so far. We did a whole episode with Tom Multaire on the exposome, and we touched on it again with Dr. Joe Pizzorno.
True, both great guests and a great subject to continue talking about. It just makes me think of the fact that one of the functional medicine nodes is biotransformation and how that relates to environmental exposure and detoxification. So, this is a really important concept, and I think it's a good idea to spend a little bit more time digging into some of the toxins, and specifically maybe a couple of the heavy metals.
Well, when I look at that functional medicine matrix and the node of biotransformation, it always makes me stop and think, what do they mean by biotransformation?
Wait, are you doing what I think you're doing? I mean,
you know exactly
you're
what I'm
asking
doing.
me what biotransformation means.
I'm
I think that's a term, right?
I'm doing what I do best.
And I
pull
think
it
you're
back.
asking me to define that term.
That's exactly what I'm doing.
Oh, yeah. You know what time it is? It's time to define some terms.
Okay, well, according to Webster's dictionary, biotransformation is the transformation of chemical compounds within a living system.
Wait a minute.
It's
Biotransformation is the transformation of things in the body.
Yeah, apparently.
It begs the question, do we need the word biotransformation?
Exactly. There's got to be more to this.
And there must be more, because that whole intro was fantastic.
Was it?
And the delivery of the information was not so great.
Lackluster.
So what else we got?
Well, if you go to functional medicine, they have their own definition of
I
what
see.
biotransformation reflects, and that's why there's an entire node on the functional medicine matrix devoted to it.
Yeah, and the way that we talk about biotransformation from a functional perspective is more how it relates to the body is transforming things like drugs, toxics, and other kind of negative environmental chemicals, how it's able to go through phase 1, phase 2 detox, transform those molecules, and ultimately eliminate them.
Using the emunctories, which is my new favorite word since coming to Genova.
So proud of you.
Thank you.
Sound like an naturopath sitting over there. Yeah, the emunctories, right? Opening up the emunctories means essentially opening up the channels for detoxification. So that includes things like the gut, right? Because we eliminate so many things through the gut. That's part of phase 3 detoxification. And kidney function, liver function are like your major emunctories. The skin is a huge emunctory. Major detox organ, right? The skin.
Yep.
We don't think about the skin that way.
Well, I do now.
Proud of you. Proud of you. And why do we care so much about this environmental medicine thing?
Well, I think the fact of the matter is that in our day-to-day lives, everywhere we go, everything we do, we're exposed to a lot of different things like plastics, car exhaust, various metals. It's in our food, it's in the soil, it's in the water, it's in the air. So it's everywhere. And our body is pretty well equipped to handle it. But it does beg the question of how can we avoid these?
Right, because avoidance is primary. If we're talking about environmental medicine, we're talking about ultimately two main things: reduction of exposure and then encouraging detoxification and elimination, right? And we always think about this bucket analogy. So you think about your body as being this bucket, and it's able to tolerate a certain volume. And so our body can tolerate a certain volume of environmental chemicals exposures. But if you keep adding to the bucket, it's going to start overflowing and causing problems. So you want to make sure you're reducing how much is coming into the bucket, but at the same time, you want to like essentially try to eliminate from the bucket by creating greater channels of detoxification by, you make a hole in the bucket, in the bottom of the bucket, essentially.
And I think because there are hundreds and thousands of different types of things you can be exposed to, maybe for the purposes of this podcast episode, we just hit on a couple of these heavy metals like we touched on earlier.
It's a good place to start because environmental medicine is a big topic, but a big contributor, a big problem is specifically heavy metals.
We know that some toxins like plastics can be obesogens and endocrine disruptors.
Yeah.
But specifically when we talk about heavy metals, we think about things like competing with cofactors for enzymatic reactions, which can interrupt the Krebs cycle, which we need to make energy. We think about it interfering with cell signaling and calcium channel blocking. So the effects can be far-reaching, and basically the symptoms of its physical manifestations can be far and wide.
Yeah, they tend to wreak havoc on enzymes, essentially. And so, that can have long downstream effects as far as clinical presentation that can be associated with cancer risk, that can be associated with like chronic fatigue, that can be associated with all these different things that, it just adds to the layer of complexity when you're talking about chronic disease. It makes me think about the fact that these heavy metals, most of them, if you're exposed in abundance, they're going to get deposited in different tissues. They're going to end up in your brain. They're going to end up in your bone, in your kidney, things like that. And the longer it sits there, the more enzymes it's disrupting and the more havoc it's wreaking.
Okay, well, knowing that they have such far-reaching effects clinically and biochemically, we look at tests all day long, Michael, right? We speak to doctors on the phone.
We sure do.
What are the top 3 heavy metals that we hear about on the phone and see clinically that are a real problem?
Top 3 heavy metals that we see on the test?
That we see.
That cause a problem?
That's right.
I would say lead, mercury, arsenic.
Wow. Wow, that's pretty ominous sound.
It's a little
We
dramatic.
should probably take these seriously then.
We should absolutely take these seriously. There's no doubt in my mind about how serious we should be taking these. In fact, we should be taking them so seriously that we should spend a podcast talking about them.
That's a great idea.
It is a great idea.
Wait.
Let's start with lead. Patti, word association. When I think about lead, where are you getting it?
Well, when I think about lead, I think about where we used to get it a lot, which is in paint and gasoline and exhaust. But we've come a long way to lowering that exposure.
Yes.
What do you think about?
I think about paint, but I also think about how we used to put lead in like glass. You know what I mean? Like you'd have those little whiskey bottles that were like leaded.
Why are you looking at me?
I'm just saying. I don't know. For some reason, I was looking across the table and I thought about lead and whiskey, and it just happened to be making eye contact, I guess.
And we've come a long way over the past decades in reducing that exposure. But what most people don't realize that it's not only those big places, but it's also in the soil. It's in food. It's in And it can even be found in water systems.
Yeah, and that's why a lot of people like you can go to Home Depot or Lowe's or whatever, and you can buy little lead strips to test your water, to test your paint. That's how common it is to be in your environment, and not to mention all the food substances that might be contaminated. I always think about when I'm thinking about lead, when I'm thinking about mercury, I think about seafood, fish.
Right. And some of it, you think, well, if it's in the soil and it washes into the water systems, there's fish there, and that's how they get some of that exposure as well.
Yeah. There's fish in water. Yep.
And then we eat them.
That's right. That's how that works.
That's right. See full clinical content here at the Lab Report.
The funny thing about lead is it's actually one of the heavy metals that we are very scrutinous of, even in conventional medicine, right? It's the only heavy metal that I can think of that actually routinely gets tested. Especially in children, newborns, 1-year-olds, 2-year-olds get lead tested just to make sure that they're not getting exposed. It's one that we're, at least pretty familiar with the fact that it has health consequences. And so that leads me into the question, like, what are some of the health consequences?
Well, I think if we're talking about the health consequences, we try to figure out, well, what is it doing on a physiological level, like a biochemical level?
We got to, right?
We love to go there.
We have to do that.
Well, one of the things that lead does is when you think about heme enzymes and making hemoglobin, lead can replace zinc on some of those enzymes and compete with the cofactor and inhibit that enzyme that's needed to incorporate iron into hemoglobin.
Oh my gosh.
Which is not good.
That's a big problem. You know what? The body needs heme, right? It's kind of like one of these things that carries oxygen around.
Kind of important.
That's a little bit important. And the other thing about heme is that it's a precursor to our cytochrome enzymes, right? So think about that. You're getting lead, you're disrupting heme, which then becomes your cytochrome P450 enzymes, which would then be used to detoxify lead. So it's like shooting yourself in the foot with exposure to lead.
Wait, so you're shooting yourself in the foot with a lead bullet?
That's right. And then it gets stores in your bones, maybe in your feet.
Well, I know physiologically we also worry about lead as competing with other cofactors for a lot of enzymatic reactions involved in things like neurotransmitter metabolism, calcium homeostasis, and it also produces reactive oxygen species and oxidative stress in general.
Well, since we got that a little bit of understanding of what happens on a physiological standpoint, from a clinical standpoint, we think about, first and foremost, probably increased risk of cancer, particularly skin, lung, bladder, liver, prostate. It's also associated with neurobehavioral changes, problems with memory, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, reproductive effects. I mean, the list goes on, and certainly hematologic effects based on its interaction with heme. So that's a big list of problems it might contribute to. I also think about the line, the line on the gum line, the gray line on the gums.
What are you on about?
No, seriously. You know what I'm talking about?
Yep. On your gums, there's a purplish hue called the lead line, or also called
Burton's line.
Right. And that usually, it's not common anymore. It used to be a lot more common, but if it's there, it's severe and prolonged lead poisoning.
So yeah, probably not something we're going to see in today's day because we're a little bit more protective about lead. But it's just an interesting little tidbit there. I think we covered lead.
Fairly good.
Where you want to move on to mercury?
Let's do mercury.
Oh man, mercury, right? What do you think of? What do you think of right off the top?
I think of fillings.
You do?
Amalgams.
I think
Dental amalgams.
I think of the Mad Hatter.
You do?
I think that explains a lot about our personalities.
Well,
or our potential mercury exposures.
Well, I also think about mercury thermometers.
Yeah. Mercury is an interesting one because mercury is, we're not as deliberate about our screening for exposure to mercury as we are with lead. And, when I think about exposure, first and foremost, the big one is fish. Right. I think pretty much know in the functional medicine community that fish is a huge source of mercury and probably one of the main reasons why you would be scrutinous of a high fish intake.
Does it come back to the ecosystem discussion?
Let's lay that out again?
Yeah.
Just in case there's confusion about how that works.
It's in the soil. Soil gets in the water. Fish are in the water. We eat the fish.
There you go. Breaking it down.
Well, in basics, there are 3 different forms of mercury you can be exposed to. And the first is elemental or metallic. And this exposure, like we said earlier, isn't as common these days, though it was fairly common back decades ago because elemental metallic mercury is found in things like glass thermometers and dental amalgams, electrical industry things like batteries and thermostats. But again, we've eased some of these things out over time.
Yeah, there's also organic mercury, which is also called methyl mercury. This is what we commonly find in seafood.
Right.
And can also be in some fungicides, so some agricultural products, as well as something like thimerosal, which is used as a preservative in that circumstance. Which is, you can nowadays get thimerosal-free injections, mercury-free injections, essentially. But that's another potential source of it. There's also inorganic mercury, and that's commonly found in industrial chemicals. So people who are around industrial plants, might be at increased risk of exposure. It's also found in things like lamps and photography, disinfectants, and skin lightening compounds. So there you go. There's some sources of organic and inorganic mercury.
Right. And any exposure to mercury can cause, like we're talking about, biochemical effects.
And accumulation.
That's right. That's right.
Mercury is often stored in the brain and in the kidneys.
And we know that just an exposure to mercury can cause oxidative stress, like we talked about earlier, and mitochondrial dysfunction. But it can also, again, affect intracellular calcium, which can then affect your neurons, your cell membrane integrity, and again, inhibiting enzymes in DNA synthesis, for example.
And that might produce lots of different clinical problems, right? I tend to think about neurotoxicity, like things like headaches as being, or maybe just changes in concentration. That's been demonstrated in the literature a bunch around mercury toxicity. But then with greater doses, you think about things like tremors, you think about nephrotoxicity, as well as iron deficiency has also been associated with mercury toxicity. So that's a good bit about mercury. And it's bad. It's not good stuff.
You know what's interesting? Before I came here to Genova, I would not have thought of arsenic as being in the top 3 or in the triumvirate. But now that I work here and we test for these things, you see how common arsenic exposure is.
Yeah, you think of arsenic and you think of like Hollywood movies.
Right.
Or you think of like, somebody who's intentionally poisoning somebody, stuff like that. But unfortunately, it's a little bit more ubiquitous than we would like to think. And what are some common sources of arsenic that we're encountering?
Well, first of all, it is found in a lot of things. Again, like water, air, soil. It's in cigarettes. It's also in cosmetics. It's in some foods and some supplements that we take.
Yeah, from a food standpoint, rice, vegetables, those are really common sources. It's used in so many different herbicides, pesticides that you think lots of agricultural products are going to have this in them, especially conventionally raised agricultural products. So that's a problem. And I hear on the phones a lot this thing about chicken being a heavy source of arsenic and I don't know whether it's like because we know it's in rice and we eat rice and chicken and rice. That's
interesting.
we're gonna just throw chicken in there.
No, we do hear that on the phone.
We do.
And we know that a lot of the arsenic that's produced in the world is used for wood preservatives. So if you're working, if you're a construction person,
or you're refinishing.
That's right.
Yep.
Arsenic exposure there.
Yeah, that's a really good one too. Or, I often worry about that. Some people will actually just, take these pieces of wood and like burn them at the end of the day. And so, that would be really, really dangerous. If something had wood finishing on it and then it was burned, that would be really bad. Stories of being a teenage boy are starting to just flood back through my memories. I don't know what it is about teenage boys and burning things, but I just burn anything you possibly can think of.
Well, you probably have a long-term chronic exposure to arsenic, which physiologically and clinically now makes a little bit more sense to me as to why you are the way that you are.
It's not just arsenic that I'm sure is in the system based on everything that was burned. It is a whole amalgam of various toxins and chemicals that will create this picture that you see before you.
Wow. Okay, well, let's talk about some of the specific biochemical and physiologic effects of arsenic.
Well, it can impair cellular respiration by inhibiting mitochondrial enzymes. This is something we've been talking about, right? You think about the Krebs cycle or all these different things that's going on in the mitochondria. These metals, they interact with I should say toxic elements because arsenic's not a metal, but it interacts with these different enzymes in your mitochondria and throughout your system. So, that's one thing. It can react with different protein groups, creating oxidation and it also inhibits DNA repair by inducing chromosomal aberrations. So it can actually cause DNA damage.
So if you translate that then clinically,
Yeah.
you're looking at a lot of different types of cancer risk, right? Neurobehavioral changes, memory, things like cardiovascular disease, reproductive effects. So they're far-reaching again. Yep.
Man, that's pretty scary.
Yeah, I think we've sufficiently scared everyone.
I mean, it's kind of a bummer, right? I'm kind of scared to go outside now, and I'm scared to eat and breathe and drink water, swim in the ocean for sure.
Okay, well, we know we're being exposed to all of these things every day.
Oh my goodness!
And there is good news. We work here at Genova, and we can test for some of these things.
That's right.
Yay.
And that's really helpful because instead of getting scared of everything, right? Why don't you find out what you might actually be getting exposed to?
Right.
And then focus on those things. Because you could walk around trying to, worry about every piece of thing that is coming into your environment and every detail of your exposome. But at the end of the day, you're going to create a lot more freedom and a lot more concise clinical intervention if you know my patient is being exposed to X or Y or Z. And the main ways that we can assess these and test for them is either in the blood or in the urine. So, Patti, tell me a little bit about the difference, why you would pick one versus the other.
Well, if you're doing a urinary assessment of toxins, it reflects a pretty recent time frame of exposure, usually 24 to 48 hours, depending on the toxin, which is pretty recent exposure.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And then when you're looking at whole blood, it can be anywhere from, day you got the blood drawn to 90 to 120 days, which is the life of a red blood cell. Still an exposure that's fairly recent, but a little bit longer than urine.
Yeah, and that's an important thing to understand because when we're testing for these things, just at a baseline level, we're really looking for exposure. We're not getting a true sense of body burden, which is a question that comes in all the time. So to do a body burden or to try to get a closer assessment of body burden, what people will do is a pre and post challenge test. They'll get the baseline, then they'll give a provoking agent, and then they'll rerun the test to see what increased over the baseline. And that might give you some window. Like if there's some sort of chelation agent that you gave, it can tell you, okay, well, this chelation agent pulled out X or Y.
From like body stores or places it has deposited.
Right.
But our tests are really just looking for a recent exposure.
Exactly. And so, that's really helpful. That's really important to know. Where are we looking at blood assessment for lead, mercury, arsenic?
We have this amazing profile called the NutriVal, where you can add on nutrient and toxic elements, which would give you a blood assessment of 5 different toxins. And that's also available as a standalone product called Elemental Analysis. But when we're talking about urine, where do we measure that?
Yeah, we have a couple profiles where we test urine elements. One of them is called the Comprehensive Urine Elements Profile. And what that is it's like I said, it's a urine test, and we're looking at a whole conglomerate of toxics, and that's also combined with some nutrient elements as well, all looking at the urine. And then the other way, if you didn't really care about running the toxics and the nutrients, you can just look at the toxics. That's called the Toxic Elements Clearance Profile.
And both of those can be added onto our profile called the Metabolomics Plus to give you a full nutritional assessment and look at toxic exposures.
That's awesome.
In a non-invasive way.
Totally awesome. And then once you have a closer understanding of what your patient is being exposed to, worry about those things, right? Worry about reducing exposure to those things, and that will create a little bit more freedom for the patient to not to have to worry about everything that you might be exposed to.
And if you're not sure, you've gone through some of the big ways people are exposed and can't really find it, there's a great website that we often send clinicians to, and it's run by the CDC. It's called the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, or the ATSDR. So if you go to atsdr.cdc.gov, every single toxin you can think of is listed there with an exhaustive list of places people might be exposed. So it's another good resource for you.
It's a great resource. And so, that's going to help you reduce exposure. And then the second phase of this is to essentially detoxify, encourage the body to get rid of those things. And, we can talk about some methods around detoxification, but the problem is that,
That's a whole episode.
I'm looking at
dude.
my watch.
That is a whole
You know
hour.
what we have to do?
What?
It's question of the day.
Do we have to?
Yeah.
Why? Why'd you have to go back to this one?
It's my favorite one. I worked on it.
This is not my favorite one.
Well, have you listened? I mean, you haven't listened to this one. I worked on it.
It's the same one. That's not different.
You sure?
It's still weird.
Okay.
What's the question of the day, Michael?
The question of the day is, on the NutrEval test, when you do the looking at the toxic elements, is the mercury organic mercury or inorganic mercury?
Such a common question that we get here at Genova. And in our blood profiles, we're measuring a total mercury. We know that there are types of mercury.
Yeah.
We just broke that down earlier. What we're measuring is the sum total of all.
So really, you're going to get a sense of any mercury exposure
That's
based on
exactly
that.
right.
Yeah, that's helpful, right? You're not limited in the overall approach to mercury.
And when it comes down to it, the result is going to be the same. You're going to look for exposures everywhere.
That's interesting.
Well, I think there's a problem here, though, Michael.
What's
if I
that?
may. We built this episode, and we've been talking, we're doing heavy metals. But really, if you look at it, we picked arsenic, and arsenic is not a heavy metal.
That's a great point. And another great point is like, if it's not a metal, what is it? What is arsenic? I don't know. Is it a transition metal? Is it one of those things that's like, it's kind of metal-like, but it's not quite a metal? I mean, what is arsenic?
Okay, well, to be fair, you're actually not far off.
Oh, really?
Right, because it has properties that are intermediate between a heavy metal and a non-metal, and is sometimes referred to as a metalloid or a semi-metal. It's kind of in the middle there. It's still a metal.
Get out of my life, metalloids. Next time on the Lab Report, we're going to finish this thing with detoxification.
Yeah, what do you do about all of this burden of toxins?
I got some ideas.
Okay. You've been listening to the Lab Report. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to our podcast, rate us, and leave us a review. To learn more about Genova Diagnostics, visit our website at gdx.net. There you'll find information on specific testing, educational resources, and how to connect with our show. Call us at 1-800-522-4762 or email us at podcast@gdx.net. Ooh, yeah, that's spooky.
It sure is, man.
And these
That's
heavy
just-
metals can be spooky.
They are spooky. You know, one of the things that makes them so spooky? They're everywhere. They're all around you.
Is that your Batman voice or your Cookie
It
Monster
is.
voice?
I don't know. I think it is my Batman voice. Patti, heavy metals are everywhere.